In this last lecture on victims, we're going to be talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault, and this is a very timely topic in our country today. Um, we're going to start by talking about sexual harassment. Okay, sexual harassment is one of those things that has now come to the forefront because it really identifies something that can happen in the workplace. Really, the workplace is the place where we talk about sexual harassment. And the courts have identified two types of harassment. One type of harassment is where somebody in a position of power in your workplace is asking for sexual contact in exchange for compensation or advancement, or the opposite. In other words, you'll lose your job if you do not have sex with me. This is considered quid pro quo sexual harassment. You do something for me, and I'll do something for you. The other type of harassment is where someone in a position of power subjects workers to intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment because of their gender. And this particular type of harassment is called hostile work environment. Both of these types of harassment are considered sexual harassment. And any claim of sexual harassment then is dealt with in the civil courts. This is not a criminal offense, but rather a civil offense. So let's take a little bit of a look at sexual harassment, bringing a claim. In order to bring a claim, a person must show that because of his or her sex, they were subject to unwelcome social sexual contact. Okay, so it's not just what you're trying to say is it's because I'm a woman that this happened. The second one is that the conduct that you experience was sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the conditions of employment and create an abusive work environment. In other words, this was not a one-off comment that you heard one day around the water cooler, but rather it's pervasive, maybe pervasive in the company. Maybe it's allowed from many different people in the company. Maybe it's one person, but this person does it often enough so that it actually alters the conditions of your work environment. Now, those are the conditions under which you bring a claim, but there are standards by which we measure whether harassment has occurred. First of all, there are two pieces to a harassment charge. One is the subjective prong, and the other is the objective prong. So the subjective prong is really whether the person felt that way. So if I'm in a work situation and I feel that because I'm a woman in the work situation, I'm subjected to these jokes and these comments and so forth, and I feel uncomfortable, that's my subjective prong. I feel it affects me. But in order to really meet the standard of harassment, I also have to meet what we call the objective prong. So the courts have to be able to look at it and say objectively, yes, what this woman has experienced is objectively harassment. And there are a couple of different standards that the courts have used over time. So the first standard is this standard. It says that a reasonable person in a similar work environment under essentially like or similar circumstances would find the unwelcome social sexual behavior so pervasive and severe that it created a hostile work environment. Okay, this is called the reasonable person standard. What we're saying here, this is the objective standard then, is that any reasonable person who hears this story and hears about what happened at work would say, yes, this is hostile. Okay, that's the reasonable person standard. The other standards that some states used was what we call the reasonable woman standard. So in the reasonable woman standard, the female plaintiff states prima facie case of hostile environment when she alleges that the conduct which a reasonable woman would consider sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the conditions of employment and create an abusive work environment. So you can see that one standard basically focuses on the woman's view, and the reasonable person is everybody, and that would include obviously men too. Now, why is this important? It is important for a very good reason. When we look at gender differences in defining sexual harassment, you find that men and women come from quite different viewpoints in terms of what they consider harassing. So I'm just going to throw out here a bunch of findings that are pretty pervasive in the literature. I'm not going to talk about a specific study because multiple studies basically find the same thing. First of all, women are more likely to find experiences of social sexual behavior as harassing, even when both genders report experiencing the same amount of social sexual behavior on the job. So what does that mean? What that means is, let's say I had a survey, and what I said was, have you ever been exposed to these behaviors? So sexual jokes while in the workplace. And what we find is that men and women report the same amount of experiences. Men might say, yeah, there have been sexual jokes. Yes, there was this. Yes, there was that. So they report equal amounts of sort of sexual behavior on the job. But women are more likely to view those things as harassing. Okay. So in these studies, however, I think one thing that they don't do is they don't look to see whether or not the jokes, the sexual jokes, are aimed at women in a certain way. So maybe it's possible that more sexual jokes on the job demean women, and so maybe women feel that way more. But overall, women are more likely to find things, to see certain situations as harassing, whereas men are like, no, it's no big deal. Also, women use broader definitions about harassment, and they're more likely to label a specific incident as harassing, it should say, not as harassing. So again, that fits with the first statement. So there are things like off-color jokes, perhaps, that maybe women consider harassing, whereas men would say, no, it's just humor. Okay. Men, more than women, are more likely to believe that any kind of harassing behavior should be handled by the woman on their own. So if you feel like you're being harassed, or you feel like this person's mistreating you, you just need to talk to them. It's not a responsibility of the organization. So men see this more as a personal issue, not as a workplace issue. Men, as compared to women, are more likely to say that sexual harassment reported in the workplace is an exaggeration. Okay? In other words, downplaying the meaningfulness of this. And finally, when you give males and females little scenarios, this is one study where you ask them to rate video scenarios. So in one scenario, for example, there was sort of a social sexual conduct that was initiated by a professor toward an opposite gendered student. And these video scenarios varied the severity of the conduct. Okay, so in some of the videos, it was just sort of jokes, sort of off-color jokes, all the way to severe conduct where the professor actually touched the student. And what they found was that the female students found those videos to be much more inappropriate, regardless of the severity of the conduct, whereas males did not find these behaviors as inappropriate. So what you can see here is that different states use different standards for sexual harassment. Some states were using the reasonable person standard, and others were using the reasonable woman standard. As you can tell from some of these findings, those two standards are quite different. So the Supreme Court ended up having to weigh in. Okay, there was a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court that said, basically, is this a reasonable woman standard the right standard? And in fact, the Supreme Court weighed in and said, in fact, the reasonable person standard is the standard that needs to be used. So this is the standard that you'll see in most jurisdictions now. According to the Supreme Court, if it can't meet the reasonable person standard, it's not sexual harassment. The Supreme Court further kind of outlined what the criteria were for sexual harassment. One of the things that you look at is the frequency and the severity of the behavior. So frequency for low-level kinds of behavior, maybe off-color jokes or objectifying women by continually talking about their appearance, that might be low level, but if it happens often enough, then that would be considered harassment. Severity also is important because although it may only have happened once, if it was very severe behavior, as some of people have been alleging in the last few months, severity where somebody actually touches you um, or tries to force sex on you, that wouldn't need to be frequent because it's severe. The second criteria is whether the behavior is physically threatening or humiliating. Um, whether the person would feel physically threatened. For example, if a male boss uh, locked the door in their office and started to advance on you, you might be physically threatened or humiliated by something that is said in front of other workers. And then finally, whether that behavior would reasonably interfere with the employee's work performance. So again, this is happening in the workplace, and does that behavior then impact your ability to do your job? Okay, so those are the criteria that basically outline sexual harassment. Now what I'd like to do is share with you a little study that looked at, well, first of all, measures individual differences in likelihood to harass people, and then looked at what the connection is between, what is it about harassers? What is it that harassment is all about? So first of all, let me share with you a scale that was developed to measure whether a person's likelihood to sexually harass. And by the way, this scale is given almost exclusively to men, and it focuses on men as the harassers. And of course, we know that women can harass as well, but I'm just going to say that most of the studies now focus on men as the harassers, not women as the harassers. And that's something that needs to be fixed. But here's the thing. What they did was they have 10 scenarios in this likelihood to sexually harass scale. And in these scenarios, they ask you, what would you do in this situation? So here, let me give you one of the scenarios, okay? Imagine you are the owner of a modeling agency. Your agency specializes in sexy female models used in television commercials. One of your models, Amy T, is a particularly ravishing brunette. You stop her one day after work and ask if she'll have dinner with you. She coldly declines your offer and tells you that she would like to keep your relationship with her strictly business. A few months later, you find that business is slack and you have to lay off some of your employees. You can choose to lay off, Amy or one of the 4 other women. All are good models, but someone has to go. How likely are you to do the following things in this situation? So one of the questions is, assuming that you're unafraid of possible reprisals, in other words, you're not going to get caught, would you offer to let Amy keep her job in exchange for sexual favors? Okay, so what you're doing is you give people these little scenarios, and then you say, assuming that no one will ever know, what's the likelihood you would do this? Okay, the LH scales, like the likelihood to sexually harass scale contains 10 of these different kinds of items. And what they find is there are individual differences in terms of men's scores on this test. And what they find is that men who are high on the LSH scale also tend to have higher scores on hostile sexism. Not terribly surprising, right? So that they score higher on sexism scales, and they score higher on the harassment scale. These are men also who tend to not be able to see another person's perspective. Again, that makes sense, right? Perspective taking is to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, to have empathy. And so these people who are high on this harassment scale have more difficulty putting themselves in another person's shoes. They tend to also be high on authoritarianism. Authoritarianism, again, is something that you would predict. They believe in power structures, and there are those that are in power and those that are not. Okay, so this is the likelihood to sexually harass scale. And so I want to share with you another study that looked at this scale and was basically trying to figure out what is it about sexual harassment. So let me tell you, this was a priming task. And for those of you that are not familiar with a priming task, now with the ability that we have with technology, we can present people with stimuli that they don't actually see but in some ways they actually perceive. So what you do is you prime people with a word below their perception. So it flashes on the screen and you can't identify it. If you ask people what that was, it went by so fast. I can say, I saw something come on the screen, but I'm not quite sure what it was. And what you're doing is you're flashing it at such a quick um, pace that the person's not aware of what the word is. But it turns out that our perceptual system has seen the prime, okay? You're not aware of it, but it has been primed in your perceptual system. And when you prime people with words, okay, the prime then should lead you to recognize words that are associated with the prime. So not to get too bogged down in the neural network kinds of things, one of the things that we know is that in our memory, in our neural network, things that are more associated with one another. So for example, if I primed you with apple and then showed you orange, you should be quicker to see orange than if I primed you with apple and showed you a spoon, okay? Because they are more connected neurally. So one of the nice things about these priming tasks is then you can see whether or not certain things are connected, okay? So what this particular study did was looking at what is the association between sex and power. And what they did was they gave men the likelihood to sexually harass scale, and then they primed them either with power words or sex words, okay? So you might get a power word, and then the question is, how quick are you to recognize sex words as compared to neutral words if you're primed with power? Or alternatively, let's say I prime you with a sex word, how quick are you to recognize power words as compared to neutral words? Okay? And what they found was that the LSH scores predicted the power-sex association. And as you might predict, men that were higher in the likelihood to sexually harass were quicker to recognize power-sex pairs than power-neutral or sex-neutral pairs. Okay? What this suggests is that harassment is not only about sex, but it's also about power. So again, this is probably not terribly surprising to you, but it's a study that shows you, again, that some of the motivation for harassment may not simply be the motivation to have sexual contact, but rather to assert your power over somebody else. Okay? Let's turn now and talk a little bit about sexual assault. In terms of sexual assault, what are the prevalence rates? Well, we don't really know because the prevalence of sexual assault varies based on the questions that you ask, who you're asking. If you're using legal reports of sexual assault, you're going to underestimate sexual assault immensely because sexual assault is thought to be one of the most underreported crimes there is. So you're going to have to come up with different strategies. Various strategies are to ask people about their own victimization or their own perpetration. And what you find is, no surprise, if you ask people if they've been a victim of sexual assault, you see higher rates reported by victims than perpetrators. Perpetrators then asking people, have you ever done this to someone else? Okay, so you tend to get higher rates. Also, you tend to get higher rates when you talk about behaviorally specific items. So for example, if you simply ask people, have you ever raped anybody? They would say no. So you get much lower rates. But if you ask them specific things, like on a train or a bus or public transportation, did you ever put your hand on someone's breasts, buttocks, whatever? And then you'll find much higher rates. And it's because people do not consider, just if you use the word rape, it brings one connotation to their mind. Even if you use the word sexual assault, well, I didn't sexually assault them, I just touched them. So you have to think about how the questions are being asked and who's being asked in order to gauge prevalence rates. So let's take a little bit of a look at victims who report and perpetrators who report, and what is the range here? What I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you 3 studies that had samples of women, basically asking about whether they had ever been the victim of an attempted or completed rape. Okay, and these studies are very old, but I'll come back to them in just a second. So this study was done in 1998. It was a nationally representative sample of women, asking if they'd ever been the victim of an attempted or completed rape. And in this study, they found 18% rate of attempt or completed rape. Another study done the same year by Merrill et al. Was asked women Navy recruits that same question, and they found that 45% of those women reported attempted or completed rape. And then finally, this is a much older study, but still using a rather large sample, a nationally representative sample of college women, okay? And they reported 27% of the sample reporting an attempted or completed rape. So here you've got in these 3 different studies from 18 to 45%. I've looked several times over the years for much better reporting, but I'm going to be honest with you, there are very few really good studies out there. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, publishes yearly stats on victims sexual violence, sexual assault, and their reports are about, more recently, from 16 to 25% of their samples report an attempted or completed rape. Also, that you get sort of the same thing from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. The problem with those statistics is that the CDC and the Bureau of Justice Statistics just report these numbers, and they don't tell me, what the sample of people were. And these studies that I just reported to you, at least you know who they're talking about. So I think it would be safe to say anywhere between 16 to 25% prevalence rate if you're asking victims. If you ask perpetrators, you get a slightly different look here. So this more recent, still pretty old, but more recent, asked 195 men from one city. So it's not even really generalizable. And 8% reported that they committed or attempted a rape. Okay. Merrill et al. Again, this is the same study that looked at women Navy recruits, but then also asked 1,754 male recruits. Okay, Navy male recruits is what I should have said. And in that sample, 15% said that they had committed or attempted a rape. Remember that when you ask the women, they said 45%. So again, perpetrators tend to underreport. And finally, the same study that was done in 1987 looked at a nationally representative sample of college men as well, 2,972, and they found that 25% indicated that they had committed or attempted a rape. So you get from the perpetrators anything from 8 to 25%. So, which is quite different from the 16 or the 18 to 45% that you got from the potential victims. So trying to figure out the prevalence of sexual assault is pretty difficult. And you're going to get different numbers, again, depending on the questions you ask and who you ask. So what do we know about the victims of rape? Well, surprisingly, we know very little. What we know is that there are the reactions, what happens to victims of rape, it varies across persons. Some people, it becomes a very difficult thing to ever get over. Other people seem to be able to rally and pull themselves together. One syndrome that's often talked about with regard to rape is rape trauma syndrome. This is a series of symptoms and feelings and reactions that are typical to victims of rape. That doesn't mean that everyone experiences these, but they're more typical. So obviously emotional responses, talking about depression, fear, crying, feeling upset, things like that. Disturbances in functioning, not being able to go out, not having fun with friends, not being able to function the way they did before. Changes in lifestyle. They talk a lot about not being able to perhaps date men, okay? This might have been a young woman who was single and dating and having fun, going to school, going out with friends, and no longer doing that. So changes in lifestyle, okay? And also part of the rape trauma syndrome is this idea that there is recovery, but it's long-term. The most severe symptoms for many rape victims occur during the first week, obviously, and they tend to diminish during the next two or 3 months and then plateau. And what I mean by that is, again, there's huge variation from victim to victim, but over the next 2 or 3 months following the sexual assault, the intense symptoms tend to disappear and then level off. Now, where they level off will differ from from victim to victim, such that when that plateau happens, it may plateau for me at a point where I no longer am recovering and I'm still at a high degree of disturbance. Another woman may have be more resilient and have made peace with what happened, and her plateau will be at a much higher functioning than me. So again, that plateau could be different for different people. One thing we do know, though, is that having to testify in court is re-traumatizing to the victim. No matter what, whether you've been able to deal with the situation or not, going into court is another traumatizing experience for the victim. Okay? Now, I'm not going to talk more about the rape victims because we know so little about this, to be perfectly honest with you. But what I'd like to talk about that we know a little bit more about is how jurors react to rape cases. Now, two sets of variables have been studied with regard to potential juror reactions. One is what kind of victim characteristics affect jurors' decisions, and then what kind of observer characteristics affect decisions. An observer means the juror itself. So are there things about the victim that will predict jurors' decisions? And are there things about jurors that will tell you about how they are likely to decide? So let's take a look at the victim characteristics first. First of all, one of the victim characteristics that's been found consistently across studies is that the gender of the victim is predictive. And jurors tend to blame male victims more than female victims. So we have this notion, I guess, that males should be able to take care of themselves, and for them to claim that they're a victim of sexual assault, it doesn't seem to hold as much water. And it's really interesting because this is true even if the victim is a child or an adolescent. Now, you'd expect a child not to be able to fight off or prevent sexual assault, but if the victim of a sexual assault is a child and a male, they do get more blame than if a child is a female. So there's this general tendency to blame male victims more than female victims. Another thing we know is the victim's sexuality tends to affect jurors' decisions. With homosexual victims, blame more and their assault is minimized. So if the person is gay, is sexually assaulted by someone else, jurors tend to blame them more for their sexual assault and tend to minimize their sexual assault. It's not as big a deal. It's not as severe. Another factor that plays into jurors' thinking, which shouldn't, is resistance. Victims who don't resist are blamed the most. Why didn't they fight back? That's the reaction that you get. The only time you see that resistance not playing as much of a part is if the perpetrator had weapons or had violent intentions. So in other words, if the victim fears for their lives, genuinely and reasonably feared for their lives, jurors are less likely to make resistance an important variable. So for example, if you have a case in which the perpetrator used a knife, threatened the woman, threatened her life, and then she didn't resist, you're much less likely to get resistance as a factor in the jury's decision making. Another factor that's been found in many in many studies, is the victim-perpetrator relationship. Not surprising, victims are consistently blamed more in the date and acquaintance rape scenarios than in the stranger rape scenarios. So if the victim knew the person was out on a date, you see much more blame on the victim. And this is especially true if it's a marital rape. Okay, if you give mock jurors cases in which it's exactly the same case, but you make the perpetrator and the victim married, you'll see that they tend to blame the victim more, and it's also seen as a less serious crime. And finally, the other variable that has been found to be very important in people's decision making is alcohol. And if the victim was drinking at the time the rape occurred, they tend to be blamed more. Okay, so those are some of the characteristics that we find that will predict jurors' decisions with regard to sexual assault. What are some of the observer characteristics? Well, there's some fairly well-known observer characteristics as well. One is gender. As you might expect, in study after study, you find that males blame rape victims more than females. And this is found for all kinds of rape, whether it's acquaintance, whether it's stranger, whether there's a weapon, regardless, what you find is that males tend to blame the victims more. Also, they tend to rate the scenarios as being less serious. So if you compare males and females and you give them the same exact scenario and say how severe of a crime is this, how serious of a crime, males consistently get lower mean rates of seriousness. That doesn't mean every male thinks that way, but on average. Another observer characteristic that predicts decisions is gender role attitudes. One of the interesting things is in the social psychology literature, there's this thing called benevolent sexism. So there are thought to be two different types of sexism. One is hostile sexism, where you are basically think that women are inferior, that you don't believe that women are harassed in the workplace, those kinds of things. The other type of sexism is called benevolent sexism. In this type of sexism, the belief isn't so much that women are lesser beings, but rather almost like put on a pedestal, okay? That you need to take care of them, they need to be sheltered, they need to be put on a pedestal, they need to be cared for. And so this is called benevolent sexism. And what we found is that when people who have higher scores on benevolent sexism, they tend to engage in more victim blame. They tend to recommend lower sentences for perpetrators. And they tend to minimize rape to a greater extent. Okay. Now I want to say something here about benevolent sexism is women can be benevolent sexist as well. And so when you give people a benevolent sexism scale, you see huge individual variation in terms of benevolent sexism. But one of the things that you would know is that the score on that scale is a predictor of how that person might react as a juror in that case. And again, higher scores associated with more victim blame, lower sentences, and more acceptance of rape. The final observer characteristic is what we call rape myth acceptance. And again, this is associated with gender role attitudes. And in fact, rape myth acceptance is the biggest observer characteristic or predictor of someone's decision in a sexual assault case. So let me just share with you some of the items from the rape myth acceptance scale. So this is a scale that was developed some time ago, and here are some of the items from the rape myth acceptance scale. And again, you answer these questions in terms of from like a 1 to 7 scale, from 1 totally disagree to totally agree. So rape happens when a man's sex drive gets out of control. If a woman is raped while she is drunk, she is at least somewhat responsible for letting things get out of control. Women who are caught having an illicit affair sometimes claim that it was rape. Men from nice middle-class homes almost never rape. When women are raped, it's often because the way they said no was ambiguous. So again, this is a scale. You have multiple items, and studies have shown that rape myth acceptance is associated, not surprisingly, with negative attitudes towards women. Okay, and you also find that men tend to have higher scores on the rape myth acceptance scale than women. And it's these scores on this rape myth acceptance scale that is the best predictor of how a potential juror will react in a sexual assault case. So those are some of the things that we know then about sexual assault. So we've gone through three different lectures on victims, and let's just talk about, what we can conclude. As I said, victims have been neglected by the legal system, and as you can tell, victims have been neglected by psycholegal researchers because really there should be much more that I could tell you about victims than I was able to. We know that's been changing in the past 20 to 25 years. There have been statutes and laws that allow more victim participation, and victims are becoming a more important part of the system. But however, what we know about that participation and how that affects legal decision making, or how victims heal following criminal victimization, those kinds of things are less known, and certainly the kinds of things that we need to spend more time looking at. Okay, so this concludes our section on victimization, but I just want to say in our next section, we're really going to be looking at another class of potential victims. And so we're in some ways continuing this discussion. In the next section of class, we're going to be looking at children in the legal system. And yes, sometimes children are in the legal system because they're observers, so eyewitnesses. However, quite a bit more often, children are in the legal system because they're victims, or they're part of a legal decision making that involves them. And so we're going to look at children as a special class of victims in our next section.